She spent 5 years building a man's dream and calling it a marriage. She rebranded his company, redesigned his reputation, and smiled at every dinner party while he slowly erased her name from everything she built. When she found out about the affair, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She went quiet, and that silence became the most dangerous thing in Atlanta. What happens when a woman who gave everything to the wrong man walks straight into the orbit of a Korean billionaire who sees exactly what her husband never could? What happens when a fake arrangement, designed to provoke, starts feeling dangerously real? And what happens when the man who threw her away realizes that the woman he discarded just became the most powerful person in the room? This is a story about stolen credit, silent revenge, and the kind of love that doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives with a hand extended in a quiet room, waiting for you to decide if you're ready to take it. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever had to walk away from someone who didn't deserve you? Let's talk about it. The pen weighed nothing. That was the part Deja would remember later. How something that was about to end 5 years of her life weighed absolutely nothing in her hand. The conference room smelled like leather and new carpet. 32nd floor of a Buckhead office tower. The kind of building Terrence loved because it made him feel like he belonged among men who built things. His attorney sat on one side of the mahogany table. Hers sat on the other. Terrence himself was leaned back in his chair with one ankle crossed over his knee, looking at his phone like this was a quarterly earnings call he needed to get through before lunch. Deja uncapped the pen. Blue ink. She'd specifically requested blue ink because black felt too formal for something this ugly. Page 6. Initial. Page 11. Initial. Page 14. The asset division. The one Terrence's lawyer had fought over for 3 months. Sign. Page 19. Sign again. The scratch of pen against paper was the loudest sound in the room. Terrence put his phone down. He watched her hand move across the last page with the expression of a man who had expected this to be harder, who had maybe even wanted it to be harder, because difficulty would have meant she still cared enough to fight. She didn't. "You know, Dej," he started, leaning forward with that voice he used when he wanted to sound generous and wise, the voice that had fooled her for the first 3 years and nauseated her for the last 2. "I hope you know this doesn't have to be the end of—" She capped the pen, set it down parallel to the folder's edge, stood up, picked up her bag, a structured leather tote she'd bought with her first Maison bike paycheck, the first major purchase she'd made in 5 years that didn't require a conversation, a justification, or a look. She walked out. Not fast, not slow, not dramatically, just out. The way you leave a room that no longer holds anything that belongs to you. Terrence, because he was Terrence, went to the window. Maybe to watch her get into the Uber he assumed she'd called. Maybe to get the last image of her walking away so he could replay it later and convince himself he'd won. What he saw instead made his hand tighten on the windowsill until his knuckles ached. A private jet sat on the tarmac of the executive aviation terminal next door. White fuselage, subtle gold lettering along the tail. A man stood at the bottom of the air stairs in a navy suit that even from 32 floors up looked like it cost more than Terrence's car. He was still, patient, waiting. Deja walked across the tarmac toward him. No hesitation, no looking back. The man placed his hand gently on the small of her back, not possessive, not performative, just there. And they walked up the stairs together. The door closed. The engine started. Terrence Caldwell stood alone in a conference room holding divorce papers he'd asked for, watching his ex-wife leave the state in a jet that cost more than every building he'd ever developed combined. 6 months earlier. The thing about a gilded cage is that the gold makes it hard to see the bars. Deja Langston Caldwell. She'd hyphenated, because Terrence had wanted her to take his name entirely, and the hyphen was the one small rebellion she'd allowed herself. Had been living inside one for almost 5 years without realizing the door had been locked from the outside. It started the way these things always start. Not with a slap or a scream, but with something so small it barely registered. A comment at a dinner party. Dej is the creative one. She plays with colors and logos while I do the real work. Said with a smile. Said with his arm around her. Said in a tone so warm that everyone laughed and she laughed too. Because what else do you do when your husband reduces your entire professional identity to a hobby in front of 12 people holding wine glasses? Deja had a master's degree in brand strategy from NYU. Before Terrence, she'd spent 3 years at a boutique agency in Manhattan, building visual identities for startups that went on to become household names. She was 27 when she met Terrence Caldwell at a rooftop event in Brooklyn. 34, confident, an Atlanta real estate developer with a jawline that photographed well and a pitch that could make a parking lot sound like the future of urban living. He'd pursued her with the intensity of a man closing a deal. Flowers that arrived at her office. Weekend flights to Atlanta so she could see his world. A proposal after 8 months that felt fast, but also felt like certainty. Because Terrence Caldwell did not do anything halfway, and he made you believe that being chosen by him was the achievement of a lifetime. She moved to Atlanta, left her job, left her apartment on the Lower East Side with the fire escape where she used to drink coffee at sunrise, left the version of herself that had been building something. You don't need to work, Dej. I got us. But she did work. She couldn't not. When Terrence acquired a cluster of neglected buildings in Old Fourth Ward for a mixed-use development, Deja saw what he couldn't. The neighborhood didn't need luxury condos with a juice bar on the ground floor. It needed a story. A reason for people to care. She built that story. Spent 4 months researching the neighborhood's history, the jazz clubs that had thrived there in the 1960s, the community gardens, the barber shops that had survived 3 economic downturns. She designed a brand identity that wove that history into the development's DNA, the color palette pulled from vintage signage, the typography inspired by old concert posters, the marketing language that spoke to preservation rather than displacement. She named it Fourth and Foster, after the intersection where the original jazz club had stood. Fourth and Foster became the most talked-about development project in Atlanta that year. Architecture Digest featured it. The mayor mentioned it in a speech. Terrence Caldwell became the developer who understood community, the man who built with soul. Deja's name appeared nowhere. Not on the project credits, not in the press releases, not in the Architecture Digest article, where Terrence spoke about his vision for culturally rooted development, using phrases Deja had written for the brand deck that sat on her laptop under a folder called T's Project. She brought it up once. Over dinner. Measured. Careful. I think it would be good for both of us if my contribution was acknowledged somewhere. Even a credit on the website would... Baby. He set down his fork with the patience of a man explaining something to a child. This is our life. Everything I build for us. You want me to put a byline on our marriage. She didn't bring it up again. The affair revealed itself on a Tuesday in September, because destruction rarely has the decency to arrive on a day that feels significant. Terrence had left his iPad on the kitchen counter. Deja was making coffee. The French press she'd brought from New York, one of the few objects from her old life that had survived the move. The screen lit up with a notification, a text message. Not explicit, not incriminating in the cinematic sense, just 4 words from a name she recognized. Last night was everything. The name was Vanessa Liu, wife of Raymond Liu, Terrence's business partner on 2 ongoing projects. Deja knew Vanessa. They'd sat next to each other at a benefit gala 3 weeks ago. Vanessa had complimented her earrings. Deja set the iPad down, poured her coffee, drank it standing at the window, watching the Atlanta skyline pretend that nothing had changed. She didn't confront Terrence, didn't cry, didn't call her mother or her sister or her best friend. Instead, she did something that would have terrified Terrence if he'd been paying attention. She went quiet. Over the next 2 weeks, Deja moved through their life like a woman made of glass, present, transparent, and carefully still. She smiled at dinners, kissed his cheek when he left for work, asked about his day, and at night, after he fell asleep, she sat in the guest bathroom with the door locked and her laptop open. updating a resume she hadn't touched in 5 years. She rebuilt it from scratch, not because her skills had atrophied. She'd been doing brand strategy work the entire time, just without credit, without pay, without her name. But because the woman who had written the original resume no longer existed. That woman had been confident, certain. This woman was someone who needed to prove to herself, line by line, bullet point by bullet point, that she was still real. The job listing appeared on a Wednesday. VP of Brand Strategy, Maison Bayek, a Korean luxury fashion house opening its first USR headquarters in Atlanta. The posting read like someone had written it specifically for her. Brand architecture, cultural positioning, visual identity systems, cross-market storytelling. She read it 4 times, applied at 2 a.m. while Terrence snored in the next room. The interview process took 3 weeks. 2 rounds with the executive team in Atlanta, 1 video call with the creative director in Seoul, and 1 final meeting, in person, non-negotiable, with the founder and CEO. That was how Deja Langston met Seungmin Baek. The first thing Deja noticed about Seungmin Baek's office was that it contained almost nothing. A desk, walnut, clean-lined, Japanese-influenced. A single chair behind it, one in front. No family photos, no awards on the wall, no decorative objects signaling taste or status. Just a window that took up the entire south wall, pouring Atlanta's October light across a floor so clean it looked like water. Seungmin sat behind the desk reading her portfolio on a tablet, and he did not look up when she entered. Not for 10 seconds, not for 30, not for a full, excruciating minute during which Deja stood in the doorway, wondering if she should sit, speak, or simply accept that she had become invisible again. Then, without looking up, "The Fourth and Foster Project, this was yours." It wasn't a question. Deja felt her chest tighten. Yes. The brand identity, the naming, the visual system. That was my work. Your name isn't on it. No. He looked up. His eyes were steady and unreadable, the gaze of someone who had learned long ago that showing reaction was a form of currency he preferred not to spend. Why not? Deja had prepared for questions about her process, her influences, her 5-year gap in formal employment. She had not prepared for someone to look at the one thing she was most proud of and most ashamed of, and ask the simplest, most devastating question possible. Because I let someone else take credit for it. Silence, not awkward, not punitive, just space. He let the answer exist in the room without rushing to fill it with reassurance or judgment. That won't happen here. He set the tablet down. Every piece of work that leaves this company carries the name of the person who made it. Non-negotiable. If you can't claim your work, you can't do your work. Do you understand? Yes. Good. You start Monday. No handshake. No congratulations. No warmth whatsoever. He picked up the tablet again and resumed reading something else, and Deja walked out of the office feeling like she'd been hit by a very precise, very clean truck. Working for Seungmin Baek was like being enrolled in a masterclass taught by someone who had no interest in whether you enjoyed the experience. He rejected her first proposal on a Tuesday, a comprehensive brand positioning deck for Maison Bayek's US launch. 47 slides she'd spent 2 weeks building, staying late every night in the new office on Peachtree Street, fueled by takeout and the desperate energy of a woman trying to prove she still had it. He sent it back with 3 words in the margin of slide 1, "Too safe, again." She rebuilt it, pushed harder, took risks with the visual language, introduced a campaign concept that played on the tension between Korean tradition and American street culture. Sent it Thursday. Friday morning. Her inbox. Closer. Still not there. The tension is intellectual, not emotional. I don't want people to think. I want them to ache. Again. She stared at the email for a full minute, jaw tight, and then, because old habits die hard, and because 5 years of living with a man who dismissed her work had rewired her nervous system, she felt the familiar heat of shame crawling up her neck. The voice, "You're not good enough. You never were. He's going to figure that out." just like Terrence did. But then something shifted. A smaller, quieter voice, one she hadn't heard in years. He's not dismissing you. He's reading every word. He's pushing because he thinks there's more. She went back to the deck, tore it apart, started from the emotional core instead of the strategic framework. Built the campaign around a single question. What does it feel like to wear something that was made for you? Not for a version of you the world finds acceptable, but for the actual, complicated, unfinished you. She sent it at midnight. Subject line, third time. Final answer. His response came at 12:04 a.m., which meant he'd been awake, which meant he'd been waiting. Now we're talking. My office. 9 a.m. That meeting lasted 2 hours. It was the first time she heard him say something that wasn't a directive or a critique. Somewhere around the 40-minute mark, while she was walking him through the visual identity system, he leaned back and said, almost to himself, "You see things other people walk past." It wasn't a compliment in the way she was used to receiving them, not wrapped in charm, not delivered with a smile designed to make her feel grateful. It was an observation, clinical, factual, and somehow, that made it the most meaningful thing anyone had said about her work in 5 years. Deja filed for divorce on a Thursday in late October. She did it quietly, through an attorney she found herself, not one of Terrence's golf buddies, not someone from his network, but a woman named Patricia Hayes, who worked out of a modest office in Decatur, and who had a reputation for being thorough, patient, and impossible to intimidate. Terrence did not take it well. He showed up at the house, their house, though it had never felt like hers, with the wounded disbelief of a man who had genuinely never considered the possibility that the woman he'd been neglecting might decide to leave. "Where is this coming from, Dej? We have a good thing. We have a life." She watched him pace the living room, gesturing at the furniture, the art on the walls, the view of the beltline from the balcony, as if the accumulated square footage of their life together constituted an argument. "I know about Vanessa." The pacing stopped. Listen, that was nothing. That was a mistake. One time. It didn't mean... Terrence. Her voice was calm. Not performed calm, genuinely calm, in the way of someone who had already grieved the marriage and was now simply managing its logistics. "I'm not doing this. The papers are filed. Patricia will contact your attorney on Monday." "Who the hell is Patricia?" "My lawyer." He stared at her. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not remorse, not guilt, but something worse. The realization that he had lost control of the narrative. Terrence Caldwell did not get left. Terrence Caldwell was the one who decided when things ended, how they ended, and what the story would be afterward. "You're making a mistake." His voice had dropped. Quiet. The voice he used when he wanted to sound dangerous but was actually just scared. "You walk out of this marriage, you walk out with nothing. Everything we built. Everything you built." She picked up her keys. "That's always been the story, hasn't it? Your vision, your project, your name. I'm just correcting the record." She moved out the next day. Rented a 1-bedroom in Kirkwood, small, bright, with a kitchen window that faced east. She drank her coffee there every morning watching the sunrise. And for the first time in 5 years, the silence around her felt like space instead of suffocation. Seung-min noticed the change before she spoke a word. Not the divorce. She hadn't told anyone at work. But the shift in her energy. She arrived earlier, stayed later. Her work got sharper, more daring, as if some internal editor that had been second-guessing every instinct had finally been fired. He didn't ask. Seung-min Baek did not ask personal questions. He operated on a principle that felt almost architectural. People revealed themselves through their work, and if you paid attention to the work, you didn't need to excavate the person. But one evening in November, the architecture broke. Deja was in the office at 7 p.m. Alone, or so she thought. She was on the phone with Terrence's attorney, who had called her personal cell, despite Patricia's explicit instructions to go through counsel. The attorney's tone was casual, almost friendly, which made the content worse. Terrence was contesting the intellectual property clause. He wanted it established that all creative work produced during the marriage was a joint marital asset. Translation: he wanted legal ownership of her ideas. Deja handled it. Voice steady, responses precise. She told the attorney to direct all future communication through Patricia. And she hung up, and she set the phone down on her desk, and she pressed her palms flat against the surface, and she breathed. When she looked up, Sung-min was standing in the hallway. Not eavesdropping. He'd clearly been walking past on his way out. But he'd stopped. And the look on his face wasn't pity. It wasn't concern in the soft, patronizing way she'd come to expect from people who learned about her situation. It was recognition. The look of someone who had seen this exact thing before, and remembered exactly how it felt. He didn't say anything, just gave a small nod. The kind that said, "I heard enough to understand, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't," and kept walking. The next morning, there was a memo on her desk. Internal stationery. His handwriting, precise, almost architectural. The letters sharp and evenly spaced. Charity Gala, December 14th. The Caldwell Foundation will have a table. Several of your husband's business associates will be in attendance. I need someone who understands both the fashion industry and the Atlanta social landscape to represent Maison Baek. Strictly professional. Let me know by end of day. Deja read it twice. The Caldwell Foundation. Terrence's foundation, the one he'd started for the tax benefits and used for networking. Half of his investor circle would be at that gala. Sung-min wasn't asking her to be his date. He was offering her a stage, a chance to walk into her ex-husband's world on the arm of a man who made Terrence Caldwell look like a regional sales manager, not as a rescued damsel, but as a professional representing a global brand. He was offering her a performance. She walked into his office at 4:47 p.m. He was reading. He always seemed to be reading. The gala. I'll do it. He looked up. For half a second, so brief she almost missed it. Something crossed his face that wasn't professional. Then it was gone. Good. I'll have the events team coordinate wardrobe. I can dress myself. The ghost of something that might have been amusement flickered at the corner of his mouth. I'm sure you can. But you'll be representing a fashion house. The wardrobe is a business expense. She turned to leave. At the door, without turning back. For the record, I know what you're doing. I'm attending a charity event with a colleague. Sure you are. She walked out. She didn't see the way his eyes stayed on the empty doorway for 3 full seconds after she was gone. The Caldwell Foundation Gala was held at the Atlanta History Center on a Saturday night in December, and Deja arrived feeling like a woman walking into a burning building wearing fireproof armor. Sung-min met her at the entrance. Navy suit, white shirt, no tie. He looked like the kind of man magazines wrote profiles about under headlines like "The Future of Luxury," composed, deliberate, and projecting the quiet confidence of someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to fill a room. He looked at her, not the way Terrence used to look at her, assessing, cataloging, deciding if she'd pass inspection. Just looking, seeing. Ready? Born ready? Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. Something before a smile, the tectonic plate movement that happens underneath before anything reaches the surface. Then let's go make your ex-husband wish he'd been a better man. The gala was a masterclass in controlled devastation. Sung-min Baek, it turned out, was a man who understood the politics of proximity. He didn't drape himself over Deja or perform possessiveness. He simply existed in her orbit with such natural gravity that everyone in the room recalculated their assumptions. He pulled out her chair at the table, inclined his head when she spoke, angling his body toward hers in a way that made every conversation feel like the two of them were the only people in the room. When a waiter brought champagne, he handed her a glass before taking his own, not gallantly, not performatively, just first, as if it was simply the order of things. Terrence noticed. He was across the ballroom, holding court at a table of investors. And Deja watched the exact moment recognition hit. The way his jaw tightened. The way his hand paused mid-gesture. The way his eyes tracked from Deja to Seung-min, and then locked there with the intensity of a man who has just realized the game has changed, and he doesn't know the new rules. Deja felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not revenge, not triumph. Relief. The specific, bone-deep relief of being seen by a room full of people standing next to someone who didn't need her to be smaller so he could feel tall. The after-party happened by accident. Or at least, that's what they told themselves. The gala ended at 11. Seung-min's driver pulled up. Deja should have gone home. Instead, Seung-min said, "I haven't eaten actual food in 6 hours, and I refuse to count canapés." And 20 minutes later, they were sitting across from each other in a 24-hour diner on Ponce de Leon, Seung-min in his navy suit looking wildly out of place under fluorescent lights, Deja with her heels under the table and her feet on the vinyl seat. "You were good tonight." She wrapped both hands around a mug of coffee. "I was adequate. You were the one doing the work. You pulled out my chair. That's not work. That's manners. You handed me champagne before you took yours. Also manners. You leaned in every time I talked, like I was saying the most interesting thing you'd ever heard." He paused, looked at his coffee. That wasn't performance. The sentence landed on the table between them like a lit match. Deja didn't pick it up, didn't blow it out, just let it sit there, warming the space. "Your turn." Deflection was a survival skill she'd perfected. "Tell me something real. You know more about my disaster of a personal life than anyone in that office. I know nothing about you beyond your font preferences and your pathological inability to accept a first draft." He almost smiled. Almost. The corner of his mouth moved a millimeter, a seismic event by Seung-min Baek standards. "Hey, what do you want to know?" "Why fashion? You could have built anything. Tech, real estate, finance. Why clothes?" The answer came slowly, in the measured cadence of someone who had thought about this many times but rarely said it out loud. "My mother was a seamstress in Busan. Not the romantic kind, not a designer, not an artist. She altered clothes in a shop the size of this booth, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. She could look at a garment and understand its architecture in seconds, where it was weak, where it was strong, where one adjustment would transform the entire thing." He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. "She made my school uniforms from fabric remnants. Other kids could tell. I couldn't have cared less, because I knew something they didn't. Every stitch was precise. Every seam was intentional. She didn't just make clothes. She made dignity out of scraps." Deja didn't speak, didn't need to. Some stories ask for silence, and she had learned, from the wrong person, for the wrong reasons, how to be still. Maison Baek isn't named after me. It's named after her. Baek Yeon-soo. She died when I was 23. Lung disease. The shop had no ventilation. His voice didn't waver. It was factual. Precise. The way a man speaks when he has already done his grieving, and what remains is not sorrow, but purpose. I built this company so her name would exist in rooms she was never allowed to enter. Every piece that carries the Maison Baek label is her name on a door that used to be closed. Deja set down her coffee. Looked at this man sitting across from her in a diner at midnight. This man who had built a global empire not out of ambition but out of love, out of debt, out of the fierce refusal to let someone's work disappear. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost violent, why he'd looked at her the way he did when she'd said her name wasn't on the Fourth and Foster project. He hadn't just been conducting an interview. He'd been recognizing a wound he already carried. "Seung-min, yes. Thank you. For tonight. For Nas all of it. You're thanking me for doing my job. I'm thanking you for seeing me. There's a difference." He looked at her then. Really looked. And the millimeter smile happened again. Except this time it traveled further, not quite reaching his eyes, but getting close. Getting dangerously close. "I see you, Deja Langston. That has never been a professional obligation." The check came. He paid. She didn't argue, because she understood by now that arguing with Xiong Min-baek about small things was a waste of energy better saved for the arguments that mattered. The driver took her home first. She got out of the car, walked to her apartment door, and stood there for a full minute with her keys in her hand. Not going in, just breathing. Something had shifted. Not dramatically, not a thunderclap, not a movie moment, more like a tectonic plate adjustment. A millimeter of movement deep underground that would, eventually, change the entire landscape. The appearances continued through December and into January, a product launch at the High Museum, an investors' dinner at a private club in Buckhead, a pop-up retail event in Midtown where Meisenbach debuted its first U.S. exclusive collection. Each time, the choreography was the same. Arrive together, circulate together, project the image of two people who existed in seamless professional partnership. Each time, the line between performance and reality blurred a little further. The moments that did it weren't the public ones. They were the margins. The car rides between events where the conversation wandered from brand strategy to childhood memories. The late nights at the office where he'd appear in her doorway with 2 containers of jjigae from the Korean restaurant around the corner and eat standing up while she worked, not talking, just present. The morning she arrived to find a book on her desk, a first edition of a design theory text she'd mentioned wanting to read, with no note, because a note would have made it a gesture, and he was not a man who made gestures. And then there was the rehearsal. It happened the week before the investors' dinner, in his office after hours. He was standing at the window, and she was sitting in the chair across from his desk, and they were, absurdly, practicing small talk. When someone asks how we know each other, what's the story? The truth. You work for me. That's not a story. That's a LinkedIn connection. What would you prefer? Something human. Something that makes people think there's more. There is more. The words landed. She looked at him. He was still facing the window, and she couldn't tell if he'd meant to say it out loud or if it had escaped through a door he usually kept locked. Let's practice the toast. Someone had to steer the car back onto the road. You're terrible at toasts. I am not terrible at toasts. Seong Min. At the product launch, you raised your glass and said, to continued market penetration. I watched 3 people physically flinch. It was accurate. It was a crime against human warmth. Try again. Pretend you're at the dinner. Raise your glass. Say something a person would say. He turned from the window, picked up an invisible glass, drew himself to his full height, with the gravity of a man about to address the United Nations, to partnership, to the value of... He stopped, frowned, started over, to the meaningful intersection of... Deja put her face in her hands. Her shoulders were shaking. You're laughing at me. I am absolutely laughing at you. She looked up, tears of laughter in her eyes. You sound like you're narrating a TED Talk. Just be normal. Say something you actually feel. He set down the invisible glass. The frown softened into something else. Something unguarded and almost tender. He looked at her, and she watched the walls he carried everywhere come down, one by one, like a building undressing. To the woman who walked into my office 5 months ago and made me realize I'd been building something incomplete. To the person who made me want to say things I don't have words for. To... He stopped. Swallowed. I'm not good at this, Deja. You're doing fine. I don't know how to be... warm. I don't know how to be the kind of man who says the right thing at the right time. I know how to build things. I know how to work. I know how to keep a promise. But I don't know how to stand in front of someone and... You're doing it right now. Silence. The city of Atlanta hummed 30 floors below them, indifferent, beautiful, alive. He crossed the room, not fast, not slow, just inevitably, the way gravity works. He stopped a foot away from her. She didn't stand up, didn't move, just tilted her head back and looked up at him with an expression that was equal parts terrified and certain. He reached down, touched her face, One hand, fingertips only, along the line of her jaw, the lightest possible touch. A question asked in Braille. She closed her eyes, and then she opened them, and stood up, and stepped back. I can't. Not yet. I can't be someone's performance again, Sung-min. I can't be a scene in someone else's story. I need to be. I need to know this is real. I need to know that when the audience goes home, you're still here. He didn't argue, didn't persuade, didn't do any of the things Terrence would have done. The charm offensive, the gentle manipulation, the making her feel crazy for having boundaries. He simply stepped back, put his hands in his pockets, and said, with the quiet certainty of a man making a promise he intended to keep for the rest of his life, I'm not going anywhere, Deja. And this was never a performance. You were the only real thing in every room we walked into. She left. He didn't follow. She drove home with the windows down in January, the cold air sharp on her face, and she cried, not from sadness, not from confusion, but from the overwhelming, terrifying experience of being seen by someone who didn't want to own what he saw. Just wanted to stand near it. Just wanted to make sure it was safe. Terrence Caldwell was not a man who accepted irrelevance gracefully. The whispers had been building for weeks. Atlanta's social circuit was small enough that everyone knew everyone's business and polite enough to pretend they didn't. But the sight of Deja Langston on the arm of the Sung-min Baek, founder of a fashion empire, Forbes listed, the kind of wealthy that made Atlanta's developer class look like they were playing Monopoly with real buildings, was too delicious to ignore. Terrence heard about it from Raymond Liu, which carried its own layer of irony that he was too furious to appreciate. Your ex was at the High Museum thing with that Korean fashion guy. They looked close, man. I'm just telling you as a friend. Raymond Liu, whose wife Terrence had slept with, telling him this as a friend. Terrence's first instinct was to call Deja and demand an explanation, but some survival mechanism in his brain stopped him. Demanding explanations was what you did when you had leverage. He didn't have leverage anymore. He had a divorce in progress and a PR problem, so he did what Terrence always did. He found the angle. Maison Baek was looking for a flagship retail location in Atlanta. Terrence had heard this through the grapevine. The commercial real estate market was small, and a luxury fashion house scouting for 10,000 square feet of prime retail space was news. He owned a property on Peachtree Road that was perfect. A renovated Art Deco building with original facade details, high ceilings, loading dock access. The kind of space that would make a brand like Maison Baek look like it had always belonged there. He called Sung-min's office, requested a meeting, got one. The meeting took place in Maison Baek's conference room on a Tuesday in February. Terrence arrived 10 minutes early, which was a power move he'd been using since his 20s. He wore his best suit. He brought a portfolio of the property, renderings, floor plans, comparable rental rates, a market analysis that his assistant had stayed up until midnight preparing. Sung-min arrived at exactly the scheduled time. No apology for not being early. No small talk. He sat down across from Terrence, opened a folder, and waited. Terrence launched into his pitch. The property, the location, the foot traffic data, the brand alignment. He was good at this. Selling space, selling vision, selling the idea that he was the kind of partner who understood what someone needed before they knew it themselves. He talked for 12 minutes. Sung-min listened. Then he opened his folder. Mr. Caldwell, before we discuss the property, I want to make sure I understand the full picture. His voice was even, conversational. The tone of a man discussing weather. The Fourth and Foster development, the brand identity, the naming, the visual system, the cultural positioning that earned the project its coverage in Architecture Digest, and its commendation from the mayor's office. That work was done by Deja Langston, your then wife. Is that correct? Terrence's sales smile held, but something behind it cracked. The branding was a collaborative effort. Dej had some input, sure, but the vision. I have the original files. Sung-min slid a printout across the table. Metadata from the design files, Creation dates, author fields, revision history. Deja Langston. Every file, every draft, every revision. Your wife didn't have an input, Mr. Caldwell. She built the entire identity. The brand deck lists her as sole creator. The files were authored on her personal laptop under her credentials. The only place her name doesn't appear is in your press materials. Terrence stared at the printout. His jaw worked. I don't build on foundations that belong to someone else. Seung-min closed his folder. This meeting is over. Now wait a minute. Terrence stood up. The charm was gone. The polish was gone. What was left was the raw, panicking core of a man who had just realized that the woman he'd erased had left fingerprints everywhere, and someone had finally bothered to look. You don't come into my city, and you don't get to judge how I run my business, my marriage. I'm not judging you, Mr. Caldwell. I'm declining to do business with you. There's a difference. Seung-min stood, buttoned his jacket. For what it's worth, the work she did was exceptional. You should have put her name on it. Not because it was the right thing to do, but because it was the truth. And in my experience, businesses built on erased truths don't last. He walked out. Terrence stood in the empty conference room for a long time, staring at the printout with his wife's name on every line. The fallout was quiet, but devastating. Seung-min didn't make a public statement. He didn't need to. But the story traveled the way stories travel in tight business circles, through raised eyebrows and lowered voices, through lunches where someone would say, "Did you hear about the Caldwell meeting?" And someone else would say, "Which part?" And then they'd both lean in. Within 3 weeks, 2 of Terrence's investors requested additional audits of project credits and contracts. A potential partner for a new development in Midtown pulled out of negotiations, citing alignment concerns. The business didn't collapse overnight. These things rarely do. But the foundation had cracked, and Terrence could feel the tremors. Deja found out about the meeting on a Wednesday evening, from a colleague who'd been in the office when Terrence arrived and had overheard enough through the conference room door to piece together what happened. She went to Seung-min's office, closed the door, and for the first time since they'd known each other, she raised her voice. "What did you do?" He looked up from his desk. Calm. Always calm. "I declined a real estate pitch." Do not do that with me. Do not reduce this to business. You pulled my files. You built a case. You sat across from my ex-husband and dismantled him. And you did it without telling me, without asking me, without giving me the choice to fight my own battle. Would you have let me if I'd asked? That's not the point. It is exactly the point. You would have said no. You would have said it wasn't worth the conflict. You would have protected him, not out of love, but out of habit. Because you've spent 5 years making yourself smaller so that he could stay comfortable, and the instinct doesn't disappear just because you signed divorce papers. You don't get to decide what I'm ready for. No, I don't. He stood up, came around the desk, stopped 3 feet away, close enough to be present, far enough to give her room. But I do get to decide what I'm willing to watch, and I will not sit across a table from a man who stole the work of someone I... He stopped. The word he'd been about to say hung in the air like a held breath. Someone you what? Silence. The room was very still. Outside, Atlanta was doing its thing, traffic, lights, the hum of a city that never fully slept. But inside this office, the world had narrowed to 2 people and the space between them. My father was a small business owner in Busan. His voice was quiet now. Not soft. Seung-min's voice was never soft, but quiet, in the way that deep water is quiet. He built a manufacturing company with a partner. They grew it together for 15 years. When they were finally profitable, the partner restructured the ownership documents. My father couldn't afford a lawyer. He lost everything: the company, the contracts, the reputation. He spent the rest of his life working for the man who stole his work. He died at 58 in a factory he used to own, operating a machine he used to manage. Deja felt something shift inside her chest. Not the sharp crack of anger, but a deeper, slower movement. The feeling of two broken things recognizing each other's fracture lines. I wasn't saving you, Deja. I was refusing to watch it happen again. I was refusing to sit in a room and smile at a man who built his name on someone else's talent and pretend that business is business. I don't have that capacity. I tried. I can't. She didn't speak for a long time. She stood in his office with her arms crossed and her jaw tight and her eyes burning, and she let the anger dissolve, not because he'd earned forgiveness, but because she recognized something in his confession that she'd never found in her marriage. The truth, delivered without packaging, without agenda, without any attempt to make himself look good. You should have told me. Yes. You should have let me decide. Yes. Don't do it again. I won't. She uncrossed her arms. Let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for months. Looked at this man. This quiet, impossible, infuriating man who had just revealed the deepest wound he carried and still couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence that would have told her what she already knew. She extended her hand. Not for a handshake. Not for a formal gesture. Just an open hand. An offering. A bridge between two people who had both lost something to men who took credit for other people's work, and who had both, in their own way, spent their lives trying to put the right names back on the right doors. He took it. They stood there in his office, holding hands, not speaking, not moving, not performing for anyone. And Deja thought, This is what it feels like when someone holds you without trying to keep you. The divorce proceedings entered their final phase in March, and Terrence, because Terrence was a man who could not lose quietly, made it ugly. He contested the asset division, challenged the separation of finances, questioned the timeline of Deja's employment at Maison Bayek, insinuating through his attorney that the relationship with her employer had begun before the marriage ended, and therefore constituted a factor in the dissolution. Patricia Hayes, Deja's attorney, dismantled each argument with the methodical patience of someone defusing a bomb built by an amateur. The timeline was clean. Deja's employment began in October, after the separation was already underway. The finances were straightforward. Deja had maintained a separate account throughout the marriage, into which she deposited the freelance income Terrence had told her was her little hobby money. The asset division was governed by a prenuptial agreement that Terrence himself had insisted on. Back when he was the one with assets, and Deja was a 27-year-old brand strategist with a studio apartment and student loans. And then Patricia played the card that Terrence never saw coming. Mr. Caldwell. Patricia's voice carried the calm of a woman who had been waiting for this moment. The prenuptial agreement your client drafted contains a clause, Section 12, Paragraph B, regarding intellectual property created during the marriage. Let me read the relevant language. She opened a highlighted copy of the prenup. In any intellectual property, creative works, designs, or brand assets developed by either party during the marriage shall remain the sole property of the originating party. Your client insisted on this clause to protect his own development concepts, but the clause is mutual. The room went still. Every brand identity, visual system, naming convention, and strategic framework that my client created during the marriage, including the complete brand architecture for the Forth and Foster development, is her intellectual property. She owns it, not jointly, not as a marital asset. She owns it outright, by the terms of the agreement your client drafted. Terrence's attorney leaned over to whisper urgently to Terrence. Terrence's face went through a rapid sequence of emotions, confusion, disbelief, fury, and finally, the specific shade of pale that accompanies the realization that you have built your own trap and walked into it. Forth and Foster, the project that had made his name, the brand identity that Architecture Digest had praised, that the mayor had cited, that his investors pointed to as proof of his vision. All of it belonged to the woman sitting across the table from him. Legally, unambiguously, ironically, she could have destroyed him. One cease and desist letter, and every building in the Forth and Foster development would need to be rebranded. Every marketing material, every press kit, every sign, All of it would need to be scrubbed of the identity she'd created. The cost would be catastrophic. The reputational damage would be worse. Deja looked across the table at the man she'd married at 27. The man who'd told her she didn't need to work. The man who'd taken her name off the project that built his career. The man who'd slept with his partner's wife while Deja redesigned his company's soul. He looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically. Smaller in the way that people look when you finally see them clearly. When the projection they've been maintaining flickers and you glimpse the actual person behind it. Afraid. Ordinary. Small. She picked up the pen. Blue ink. She'd requested blue ink again, because some symmetries matter, even when no one else will notice. I don't want the IP. I don't want the buildings. I don't want any of it. She signed the asset division page. Clean, simple, no dramatics. I don't need anything with your fingerprints on it. Terrence opened his mouth, and for the first time in the entire proceedings, nothing came out. No charm, no spin, no narrative. Just silence, filling the space where his confidence used to be. Deja signed the final page, set the pen down, stood up, picked up her bag, and walked out of the conference room for the last time. She took the elevator to the lobby, crossed the marble floor, pushed through the glass doors into Atlanta in March, the air warm enough to feel like forgiveness, the sky the particular shade of blue that exists only in cities that are trying to become something new. The jet was waiting. She saw it from the sidewalk, white fuselage, subtle gold lettering on the tail, parked on the tarmac of the executive aviation terminal that shared a property line with the office tower. And standing at the bottom of the air stairs, in a navy suit, patient and still, was Seung-min. He didn't wave, didn't call out, didn't do anything performative. He just stood there, hands at his sides, watching her walk toward him with the calm certainty of a man who would have waited all day, all week, all year if that's what it took. She crossed the tarmac. The wind caught her hair. Her heels clicked on the asphalt with a rhythm that sounded like the opposite of everything that had just happened in that conference room. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a closing, but an opening. Not silence as a weapon, but silence as a choice. She reached him, stopped, looked up. Hi. Hi. I signed the papers. I know. I didn't take the IP. I could have destroyed him. I didn't. Something crossed his face. Not surprise, because he had expected this. Something closer to pride. But not pride in the way a mentor feels for a student. Pride in the way you feel when someone you love does exactly the thing that confirms everything you believed about them. I know that too. She looked at the jet, looked back at him. Where are we going? Wherever you want. That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters. She laughed. Not a polished laugh, a real one, raw and slightly broken. The laugh of a woman who has just walked out of the last room she needed to leave, and is standing in front of the first door she actually wants to walk through. He placed his hand on the small of her back. Not possessive, not performative, just there. The way his hand always seemed to find that exact spot, as if it had been designed for it. They walked up the stairs. The door closed behind them. Inside the jet, Deja sat in a cream leather seat and looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline, the city that had held her marriage, her silence, her erasure, and, eventually, her rebirth. And she cried. Not quiet tears, not dignified tears, the kind of crying that comes from the deepest floor of the building, the one nobody sees, the one that holds the foundation. 5 years of swallowed words and dimmed lights and stolen credit and quiet compliance. All of it breaking loose at once. A dam that had held so long she'd forgotten the water was there. Seung-min didn't speak, didn't reach for her, didn't offer platitudes or comfort or reassurance. He sat in the seat next to hers and waited. Not impatiently, not uncomfortably. With the patience of a man who understood that some things need to be released before they can be replaced, and that the best thing you can do for someone who is finally falling apart is to make sure they know the floor beneath them is solid. When the crying slowed, Not stopped, but slowed, the way storms ease from downpour to drizzle. Deja wiped her face with the back of her hand, took a shaky breath, looked at him. "I'm sorry. I'm a mess." "You're not a mess. You're free. Sometimes they look the same from the inside." She laughed again. Wet, broken, real. He held out his hand, palm up. An offering, the same gesture she'd made in his office, returned now like a call and response, like the second half of a sentence that had been waiting to be completed. She took it. Their fingers interlocked. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He rested his cheek against her hair. The jet began to taxi, and outside the window, Atlanta slid backward. The buildings, the highways, the Beltline, the house in Buckhead where she'd lost herself, the apartment in Kirkwood where she'd started finding her way back. "Soul." The word came out quiet, certain. "What?" "You asked where I want to go." "Soul. I want to see where Maison Bec started. I want to see the shop where your mother worked." He was quiet for so long that she lifted her head to look at him. Something had changed in his face. The walls were down. Not lowered, not cracked, but fully down, demolished, cleared away. What was underneath was not the controlled precision of a CEO. It was the open, unguarded face of a man who had just heard someone ask to see the most sacred thing he carried, not out of curiosity, but out of love. The shop is gone. They built a convenience store over it in 2015. "Then take me to the spot where it used to be. I want to stand where she stood." He lifted their joined hands, pressed his lips to her knuckles, eyes closed. A gesture so quiet, so private, so completely unrehearsed that it made every public performance they'd ever done look like the theater it was. Okay. The jet lifted off. Atlanta fell away beneath them. The sky opened up, blue, wide, borderless, and Deja Langston flew toward a place she'd never been, holding the hand of a man who had never once asked her to be anyone other than exactly who she was. 3 months later, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran a feature in its Sunday Arts section about the opening of Maison Bayek's flagship store on Peachtree Road, not in Terrence Caldwell's building, but in a converted historic textile warehouse in the old 4th Ward, 3 blocks from the 4th and Foster development. The store was extraordinary. 10,000 square feet of curated space that felt less like a retail environment and more like walking into a living gallery. The design language drew from both Korean Hanok architecture and the industrial character of Atlanta's warehouse district, clean lines and raw materials, precision and texture, tradition and reinvention, coexisting in the same breath. The launch party drew 400 people. Fashion editors, industry leaders, Atlanta's cultural elite. The mayor came, 2 members of the city council, a K-pop idol whose stylist had discovered Maison Bayek 3 seasons ago and who now refused to wear anything else. Above the entrance, in the brushed steel lettering that had become the brand's signature, the name Maison Bayek, and below it, in smaller letters, precise and intentional and permanent. Creative direction, Deja Langston, not Langston Caldwell, not a hyphen, not a compromise. Just her name. The name she'd been born with. The name she'd almost lost. The name that was now etched into the facade of a building in the neighborhood where her stolen work had made another man famous. Inside the store, during the party, Deja stood near the front windows watching the crowd. She wore a piece from the debut collection, something Seungmin's design team had created specifically for the launch, though she hadn't known that until it arrived at her apartment with a note in his handwriting. For the woman who built the house. See. Seungmin was across the room, doing the thing he did at events, existing with quiet authority, speaking only when spoken to, projecting the particular energy of a man who had built something real and did not need to perform confidence because it was simply part of his composition. Every few minutes, his eyes would find hers across the crowd, not checking in, not performing connection, just finding her, the way a compass finds north. Not because it's trying, but because that's what it does. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister in New York. Saw the article. Your name is on the building, Dej. I'm crying in a Starbucks. Call me tomorrow. She smiled. Put the phone away. Across the room, a new guest arrived. Deja didn't notice at first. The crowd was thick, the music was playing, the champagne was flowing. But then a ripple went through the nearest cluster of people, the way it does when someone arrives who creates discomfort simply by existing. And she looked up. Terence Caldwell stood in the entrance of the Maison Bayek flagship store, wearing a suit that was trying too hard and an expression that was trying not to try at all. He looked around the room, at the space, the crowd, the brand, the scale of what had been built. And Deja watched him do the math. Watched him calculate the distance between the world he'd tried to keep her out of and the world she now inhabited. Watched him look up at the sign above the door and see her name. Her name. On a building she'd helped create, for a brand that bore the name of another woman whose work had been overlooked, in a neighborhood where his own stolen accomplishments were already beginning to fade. Their eyes met across the room. For one long, heavy moment, nothing moved. Then Deja did something that surprised even herself. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat, didn't look away. She gave him a nod. Small, civil, final. The nod of a woman who no longer needed him to be the villain of her story, because she had already written herself out of his. Then she turned back to the party. A hand appeared at the small of her back. Familiar, warm, exactly where it always was. Terence Caldwell is here, Seung-min said, his voice low, close to her ear. Not alarmed, not concerned, simply noting a fact, the way he noted all facts, precisely, without drama. I know. Do you want me to have him removed? No. Let him stay. Let him see all of it. All of it. She turned to face him. This man, this quiet, impossible, beautiful man who had looked at her stolen work and refused to look away, who had offered her a stage and then stepped aside so she could own it, who had held her hand in silence and kissed her knuckles on a jet and taken her to a spot in Busan where a convenience store now stood and watched her stand there with tears on her face, honoring a woman she'd never met. All of it. And she kissed him. Not a performative kiss. Not a statement kiss. A kiss that existed entirely in the private language of two people who had found each other in the specific wreckage of being unseen, and who had decided, not in a grand, dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small ones, that the rest of their lives would be spent making sure neither of them ever disappeared again. When they pulled apart, Seung-min's expression was the most open she had ever seen it. Every wall down, every defense retired. He looked at her with the full, unguarded face of a man in love. Not the performative kind, not the kind that makes speeches and grand gestures, but the structural kind, the kind that holds weight, the kind that lasts. Your name looks good on the building. Yeah, it looks like it was always supposed to be there. She took his hand, laced their fingers together, looked around the room, at the store she'd helped build, at the brand that carried the name of a seamstress from Busan, at the crowd of people who had come because something real had been created in a world that rewarded imitation. And Deja Langston, the woman who had spent 5 years in silence, who had watched her name be erased from the best work she'd ever done, who had signed divorce papers with a pen that weighed nothing, and walked out of a room that held nothing, and climbed into a jet that carried everything, stood in the middle of her own story, holding the hand of the man who had never once asked her to be anything other than herself, and smiled. Not for the cameras, not for the crowd, not for Terence Caldwell, who was already leaving through the back entrance, his footsteps quiet and small, and finally, mercifully, irrelevant. For herself. If you felt this one in your chest, you're not alone. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and leave a comment. I want to hear from you. See you in the next one.